And welcome, everybody, to a wonderful week and new year here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Those of you watching the video format, and if you're listening on the radio or listening to one of the podcast formats, maybe you can't see me, but for those of you who can, you'll notice I do have a little bit different of a setup I'm trying out for the new year. Let me know how you feel about it. Let me know your feedback. Obviously, we'll probably decorate it a little bit more there in the background, but going for a little more dramatic lighting effect. But regardless, it is a new year, so I'm very excited to have you all here. We're going to, this day, kind of look back at the last year and look at all the scandals and issues we've had and talk about, too, what are we going to do to fix it? But if you're listening radio or TV and you miss a portion or you got something you got to get up and do and you want to know where to find the Andrew Cooper Show, well, you can just visit theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's theandrewshow.com and check out all those places. If you are listening in the podcast format, I do ask, especially if you're on Apple or Spotify, please make sure you leave a 5-star review. If you don't want to leave a 5-star review because you don't like the show, well, one, I ask, why are you even listening? Really, don't you have better things to do with your life? And two, don't leave a review. Nobody wants to see that review. It's probably a sucky review. It probably doesn't help anybody out. But if you do want to leave a 5-star review, well, please feel free to do so. We greatly appreciate it here. And on today's show, as I said, we're going to look back through the year, look at some of the bigger scandals, of course, that the Beshear administration has had over the last year, the scandals Kentucky's had, kind of the impactful things, and talk about what we can do to fix it. But in that vein of conversation, I do want to start off with one thing I posted about there last week, talking about what Kentucky has done this year, in 2025, the total amount they gave out in something called the Grant and Aid Program. Now, and the reason why I want to call this out specifically, normally I probably wouldn't, this is kind of I don't want to call it a throwaway issue, not really. This continues to go on. But I think it's really important to discuss because of how other people look at these kinds of things. They look at, all the time we're calling out these kind of financial incentives that the state hands out. And you hear all kinds of arguments about why it's so incredibly important we continue to do so. And I think this is a perfect program where if you can look at this and say, that this is something that can't be cut, that this is vitally important, you're not ready to have a conversation, a real conversation, one about what should the government do on economic development, and also, of course, what's important and not important to see in our government. So here we go. So the Grant and Aid Program, this is a program where private employers, normally it's capped at $75,000 per employer, but private employers get money that pays for half of their employee training. Half of their employee training. Now, already off the bat, the reason why I want to zero in on this program is one, because of its size. A lot of people would claim, take the Ford deal, which obviously looking back on the year, we got to discuss about here later on, but take the Ford deal where we handed out, these massive incentives, $250 million cash forgivable loan. We handed out free land. We handed out tax breaks. We handed out free training programs. We handed out all kinds of things. And so you look at that kind of size program, you say, hey, look, without it, we won't get these big employers, and what's Kentucky to do? And we'll discuss about how we should be building our economy here later on today. But the point is that at least that holds some, truth on the surface, if that's what you care about, is bringing in mega corporations, and that's what you want to build your economy around. Yeah, you're right. You do have to give out those large giveaways because other states will instead and attract in those businesses. However, like I said, we'll return to that fact. However, this kind of program here, where last year, in the year 2025, we gave away, in the Grant and Aid Program, $7,089,514 to 81 different companies. Now, sorry, I had to get a drink there out of my Andrew Cooperrider Show mug. Will be available for sale here soon if you want, some Andrew Cooperrider swag. Anyways, so we... talking about this program, outside of about $2.5 million went to Ford itself, those were much larger. But generally speaking, this went to 81 different companies, taking out Ford. So 80 different companies. And we're talking about maybe $5-ish million went to those 80 different companies, taking out the Ford ones. And the max on this is $75,000. And it's supposed to pay for half the training. And the reason why this program we can really call out is just another way that we're siphoning off taxpayer dollars out of our pockets, and then we're directing them into these private corporations. And it does leave one to wonder, why are we choosing those corporations? Why are those the ones we're picking? Well, obviously, it's because these corporations, well, they fill out paperwork and everything else, but why does this program stay around? Well, it's a way of paying off the companies that then in turn give to their favorite politicians. Now, people could argue against that, say, no, that's not why it was created and everything else. And I understand, I hear you, but this is a way that they are benefiting, that companies benefit off the government, direct cash into their pockets, paying for half this training cost. Now, I find it hard to believe that these companies are being 100% honest on what their training costs will be, but putting that to the side. The assertion that this is a necessary program leads to a couple of questions. Because, they would say the point of this program is to train Kentuckians to do higher level jobs, and then in turn they'll make more money, and then in turn the state makes more money. That would be the assertion. However, I'm going to push back on that greatly. First off, just because half the training is paid for doesn't mean a company is suddenly going to create a position. So a company is not going to just say, well, we're going to create a position because we're going to get this $75,000 to pay for the training for this position. No, if they're being honest, and this is only covering half, and their real cost, if they're getting $75,000 is training these people is $150,000, they're shelling out $75,000 themselves. They're not creating positions for a $75,000 giveaway. It's too small. It's not worth it to them. So clearly, these jobs already exist and need to be filled by this company, which would lead to the question of, okay, if they need to be filled by the company and they already exist, why would we give them anything to create the job, quote unquote, create the job? You're not creating the job. The job exists. They're hiring somebody for the job. And the claim would be, well, it's so they can train somebody to do the job. Well, once again, you think they're going to shell out $75,000 to train a bunch of people how to do a job just because the state's giving them the other $75,000? And that's the decision maker for them, instead of just hiring somebody who's already has the skills, if they even exist? Of course, that's not how business works. That doesn't even factor into their decision making of whether or not they decide to train somebody or hire. Here's the deal. They can't find anybody with those skills already. Because if they could find people who already knew how to do the job, then they wouldn't be shelling out $75,000 out of their own pocket to train somebody to do it. At least 75, if not more. So clearly, the job already exists. Clearly, they already got to most likely train somebody to do the job, because it's not like the state's paying for the entire training program. And then even if it was, let's say we live in a magical world where somehow a company is going to, instead of hiring somebody who's already experienced, decide to go ahead and train people to do the job because the state's willing to pay half the training to the tune of $75,000 max. Why does the state care? I mean, honestly, why does the state care? If they're going to do the job, why do they care who does the job? The person doing the job is going to get paid the same amount. It's going to be the same amount of tax revenues. They call economic development investments. Well, investments should pay off. If in this case what we're talking about is something that isn't creating a new revenue source, but it's a job that already exists and somebody has to fill it, somebody's going to get paid to do it. Whether the state helps train somebody to do it or not, it's going to get filled. The state, it doesn't matter. And then also is your assertion that these companies here in Kentucky, because all the time they'll say, well, we need these economic developments to attract companies here. We need these giveaways to get companies here. Is your assertion that a company is going to uproot its operation, suspend its operation, lay everybody off, go through all the hoopla of moving their business over a $75,000 50% training expense coverage? Of course not. Of course that's not what's happening. But that's the kind of thought process we have to think about, because people will defend this, and people did. We'll talk about that when we get back. And with that mindset, we'll talk about the rest of the issues we've seen as we look at the year in review. We'll be back here shortly on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. And you're back here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Before the break, I was discussing this grant and aid program, how it's a silly program. It's not enough money to matter. It's not enough money to create jobs. It's literally just a giveaway. And on top of that, I detailed why the government really shouldn't have a concern about it. It doesn't really matter. And of course, there were people who came and defended it, despite everything being laid out to it. So for an example, and you always have this, every post I make about some sort of economic development, there's somebody who comes on to go ahead and explain the context that somehow is missing. And I've made this joke before, but you could literally write a book. You know, this came up too with Churchill Downs, where there's all this, well, you forgot this context or that context, or, well, you don't talk about this or that. You could literally write a 500-page dissertation on some of these economic deals, and somebody would still say you left out how much they spent on toilet paper through the process. I mean, honestly, it's absolutely ridiculous when it goes to it. But of course, there's always people too who share context, and their context is just to go ahead and, fully explain something that already is explained, that I already covered. Here's a great example. Here's somebody who commented, said, what a weird post. This was on the grant and aid program, calling out that $7 million going out to these companies. What a weird post to attack programs that actually train Kentuckians for better jobs with better pay. This confuses corporation handouts with necessary investments in the skills of Kentucky workers. Once again, the grant and aid programs are paying for training companies' employees. Company is already training this employee for the job. The grant and aid program is paying for half of it. If you want to train Kentuckians for better job, better pay, then you should be talking about things like trade schools or other type programs. I have a hard time believing that these companies are training these employees, once again, out of the goodness of their hearts. It's a profit item. I need somebody to fill this job. I'm going to train somebody to fill the job, period. And chances are the job's so specific to that company that there probably isn't a lot of people who have experience in it, so they're going to hire and train somebody. And the point is, they're going to do it without the grant and aid program. But that's what these people say. They go through and they try to argue this. This is great. They said, the argument that they do it anyway ignores the reality of global competition. If Kentucky stops being a partner in workforce development, those billion-dollar investments go to Tennessee or Ohio. These grants ensure that when the big companies grow, they grow here using our neighbors who earn high-value certificates that stay with them for life. So they're literally... So let me get this straight. So we have to give them hundreds of millions of dollars to get them to move here. We have to give them, or set up shop here. We have to give them free land, tax breaks, and all those things. And then on top of all that, they're already established. They're building a factory. When it's time to cash in, we then have to pay to train their employees for quote unquote new jobs, or else they're going to go elsewhere and go find what? They're going to move once again, are they going to move their entire factory about over $75,000? No, they're not. And it concerns me when we talk about it, because when we talk about a lot greater, stronger giveaways that going through this past year, people are not in the mindset to deal with it. And that's part of the problem, because look, you are burying your head in the sand. If you say nationally, we don't have a debt problem, you're burying your head in the sand if you say overall, Americans are being taxed to death. When you look at the raising inflation, the cost of everything going up, and then you couple in the fact that half your paycheck is going to the government at least, not just in income tax and things directly taken out of your paycheck, but every time you buy something, you pay sales tax, you got property tax, you got vehicle tax, you got insurance tax, you got gas tax that you pay at the pump. When you break it down, half your income for a lot of Americans is going to paying taxes. Half their money is being siphoned off by the flipping government. And it's still not enough for them. We got to make cuts, not just federally, but at the state level too, as well. Revenues are dropping. This year, revenues fell short of their projections by about $200 million into the state. So they had to make budget cuts, which means revenues in the future, they're going to also project them to be lower. Revenues will fall. And unless the state learns how to start cutting things that are useless and not providing anything, well, then we won't accomplish a single thing. You know, I was talking to my wife about this yesterday. I said, you know, I'd love to have on somebody who's a true expert in economic development and really talk through these issues. Whether you want to call it a debate, a conversation, or whatever, it doesn't matter. I just want to have somebody on that I can talk through these issues with. And I said, the problem is I've talked, it would end up, nobody will do it. I've tried to find a few people. Nobody will do it. If somebody's listening to this that says, I'm an economic development expert, I'd love to talk about it. Before you reach out, there's going to be some questions you're going to be asked. And here's the real problem, because I've talked to the legislators in charge of economic development. I've talked to the legislatures over the budget. I've talked to the legislature over the revenue. And I ask a simple question, and none of them can answer it. What is the formula for payoff? What is our return? Exactly. Spell it out, and taking into account, too, all the other giveaways. For an example, you have the Kentucky Entertainment Incentive Program, where we give up to $75 million in tax credits away to shows and movies that come here to Kentucky and film. You know, I posted about how season 7 of 1,000-Pound Sisters really paints Kentucky in a positive light, the kind of thing I know we should be incentivizing to go on. We gave them, in tax credit, over $1.1 million in a tax incentive to TLC to film 1,000-Pound Sisters season 7. And so you take, you know, last year they had SB1. They created this Kentucky Film Commission, and they funded that. And then they put, you know, $10 million of taxpayer funds into building a soundstage in Louisville. And they're like, this is going to bring this industry. And nobody can answer the question of what is the payoff. If you're saying, well, they'll bring jobs and everything else. Well, first off, I don't know many of out-of-work Kentuckians who specialize in film production. I'm sure they exist. But when we look at who needs a job in Kentucky, creating movies isn't in the resume, isn't in their skill level. So what are these production companies going to do? They're going to train somebody to do it? Of course not. What they're going to do is they're going to go ahead and bring people in. So they're not employing Kentuckians, they're bringing outsiders. And they're going to do with these tax incentives and everything else. And then the minute the tax incentives turn off, they'll go somewhere else that will compete heavily for them. You know, a lot of Hollywood went to Atlanta or Toronto or all these other places where they're offering these incentives. It is not a long-term thing at all, because you can decide to shoot a movie anywhere. It doesn't matter where the setting is. Literally, the show Justified, which is set in Kentucky, was filmed in California. You don't have to, just because you do a show about Kentucky, you don't even have to film it here. So they're like, well, we got to give away all these tax incentives. We got to give away money. But when do you cash in? I mean, take TLC's 1,000-Pound Sister, giving them $1.1 million. I don't know much about production budgets, but I would be shocked, and I did a little bit of research, you know, simple asking Google and whatnot, but I'd be shocked if TLC's spending over $5 million an episode making that. All in, $5 million. So is the assertion from the government that somehow we'll make our money back on $1.1 million? That's all the money they're going to bring. If they're only doing $5 million, you're going to say 20% was going to end up, over 20% was going to end up in our taxpayers' coffers here in Kentucky, so we can afford to give away this because, you know, we'll make money elsewhere from this. It's not like it's going to drive tourism. if you want to make the argument that, look, if we do a giveaway where we allow, HGTV's House Hunters to come film here and we don't charge them anything for taxes and they can basically be here tax-free, you can make an argument that, well, it's a popular show and maybe that'll cause people to move here, which somehow, for some reason, government cares about our population growth. It's a different discussion, why government would even care about that in the first place. But regardless, you can make that argument that it could drive people here. People could want to buy property here. It could buy property in rural areas. They see how cheap it is. Maybe they're a remote worker, so it's really easy for us. And so, yeah, it's worth it to us to give it to them for free. Okay, I can hear that argument. But 1,000-Pound Sisters? Who's watching that show is like, I want to move to Kentucky. Seems like a great place. Has that even crossed people's minds? I mean, we give $10 million to the soundstage, and then we give away $75 million a year in tax credits. When do we make back our $10 million? And the minute we try to start making back our $10 million, guess what? They're going elsewhere, where somebody else is going to offer them the incentives where they're willing to be at zero, because for some reason, having a movie filmed in your state to politicians is like a golden pin that they just love the idea of, despite the fact it does nothing for the bottom line. But regardless, we got to cut. And these types of projects, like I'm talking about economic development experts, knowing how do we make our money back when you consider all the cuts? Where do we make our money back on this? When do we do it? What's the formula? How much money do you get? When do we get it back? I know it's supposed to be whatever we can make back in 5 to 10 years, but I ask you, what is it? What's the economic impact of giving away $75,000 max to a company to cover half their training costs? What is it? Exactly. Dollar for dollar. Not, well, this dollar moves that. No. How much more money will the state make with this quote unquote investment? Because investments are supposed to pay off. But regardless, I have more questions for these economic development experts. Love for one to come on the show, like I said, but we'll discuss more of that when we get back here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We'll be back in a few short minutes. And you're back here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. So before the break, we were discussing, I want to have on an economic development expert, and I want to ask him some questions. Now, we went through, for an example, the film industry. Where's our payoff there? It's hard for me to see it. I went through the grant and aid program. Is the assertion that a company wouldn't just, hire somebody to do the job anyway? Let's talk about that decision. I mean, the problem is you can't ask a company because they want to continue to make that money, right? But I have another question for him, too. Because as we look back at the years, we look at something like, take the Ford battery plant, okay? Bust. Not happening. They're pivoting. We'll see what ends up happening there, but they've laid off all 1,600. Funny remark on that. There's a clause in the contract that if they do what they did, Kentucky could claw back all $250 million immediately, demand repayment of all $250 million in that forgivable loan we gave them. I mean, we still gave them 1,400 acres, and federal government still gave them billions to build the plant. But regardless, we could immediately demand back our $250 million after they laid off everybody. But Bashir's choosing not to do that. And I do wonder, by the way, and we'll get back to economic development, but I do wonder if that has something to do with the origins of this. Let's not forget that the person who built this plant is Gray Construction. And Jim Gray, whose family owns Gray Construction, is Bashir's transportation secretary. Let's also not forget that around the deals, at the time when the deal was being negotiated, the Economic Development Cabinet Secretary Larry Hayes, who was key in negotiating the incentives, he co-owned 8.5 acres of land right near the Glendale megasite. And what's crazy about the fact that he owns land that he'll directly financially benefit from this Glendale megasite, because, of course, land costs go up. Back in 2009, during an earlier unsuccessful attempt to attract a factory to that same location, the executive branch ethics committee specifically said, hey, you shouldn't be involved in this. But, you know, it is what it is. So he continued to be involved in it. And so that raises concern. So you wonder if, part of not wanting to call that deal in too much is he's just trying to, at this point, avoid any further scrutiny on the project. Good luck with that. But anyways, as we see with that going belly up, or we see Ford and with their 12,000 other jobs in Louisville and layoffs and rebuilding this line and that line, and you see all these huge economic giveaways. I understand the desire to a degree. I would argue from a governmental standpoint, if you have a massive unemployment problem, like you've got 3 job seekers for every job you have available, I understand why as a company, you might look at that and say, as a state, you might look at that and say, hey, we need to do something. We need to attract some people in because this isn't sustainable for us. I get that. That's not the position Kentucky's in right now. Kentucky actually has a 1-to-1 ratio. We have 1 job opening for every job seeker. Now, granted, not every job seeker is looking for that exact job that's open or whatever, but from a governmental standpoint, as you talk about, do we need to attract in jobs or not? And I made this argument about the Hardin County battery plant in the first place, that it didn't need to go there because there wasn't enough job seekers in that area to fulfill the jobs. They didn't need it. If you want to make the argument it should go, I don't know, somewhere else where there's actually people looking for a job there, then yeah, sure. Okay, I can hear that argument, but there wasn't even job seekers there. And so you wonder about this. There's this weird thing government has, and it's not weird, I know where it comes from, but government has this thing where they just want to constantly grow. They talk about, we need to grow our population, we need to grow our tax base, we need to grow our tax revenues, we need to grow this, we need to grow that. Why do you need to do that? Why do you feel a need? Some would argue and say, well, it's so we can provide more services to people. Look, you got 4.4 million people. You got a budget of $70 billion a year-ish here in Kentucky. If you can't provide basic services like roads and bridges and police to your 4.4 million, what makes you think you could do it better to 5 million or 6 million? What makes you think that will fix your problems? Because I'll tell you this. If you think it might, go to a state that has 6 million people, and guess what they say? The same exact thing you're saying now at 4.4 million. We need more people in. We need a larger tax base. We need more revenues to fix all of our problems. Your desire comes from one thing. You want more control. The bigger the state, well, the fancier you are when you go out and about into the world. The more important, the more people you have to control, well, the better you feel. You're a little more powerful. You have more people whose lives you can control. But I'd argue that's not even government's role in the first place. We have a 1-to-1 ratio. Why are we worried about jobs right this second and not worried about saying, hey, look, we need to get our workforce to work? But also when it comes to building up an economy, and this is what drives me crazy, it's because all these programs, these hundreds of millions of dollars here and there and there and there, we're being taxed to death. Cuts have to be made. They have to be made. And you're siphoning money off people who would be small business owners. And that's my point overall. If I was building an economy, I wouldn't build it based upon a battery plant in Hardin County. I wouldn't build it based upon a Ford factory. I wouldn't even build it based around a Toyota factory per se if I'm starting from scratch. I'm not sitting here saying, let's give away the entire kit and caboodle to get in this one employer, because what do you do if that employer leaves? There's these cities that build up their economy around one employer. And when these employers leave, their entire economy's bust. They had all their eggs in that one basket. So if I'm starting from scratch, I'm saying, how do I get as many small businesses as possible? Because an individual small business may fail, and that may cost us 10 jobs or so, but we're not going to do something like what just happened to Glendale, where literally 2,100 people in one fell swoop lost their job. So what do we do to encourage small business owners? Well, you lower your taxing. You let everybody keep more money in their pocket so they can afford to invest in themselves, bet on themselves rather than, relying on you to take money out of their pocket to spend it for them. But are we going to see that difference here? Are we going to see that change? Do we have Republicans willing to do that? No, of course not. They don't see that picture. Why? Because, frankly, they're not paid to see that picture. People come to them and say, look, we got some jobs we'd like to offer. We just want a little something here on the side. Now, if you could do that for us, maybe some money ends up in your campaign account, friends of ours we take care of. And then the person sits there and says, well, it's government's role, of course, to create jobs, which, by the way, used to be the opposite of the Republican Party platform. The Republican Party platform at least used to say, I know it was changed in 2024, but it used to say that Republicans recognize that government doesn't create jobs but can only hinder them. That never stopped Republicans, though, from claiming, look at these jobs we've created. Even though they didn't create anything. Regardless. But we've got to start looking at these types of issues and say, how do we build an economy here in the state that is stable, that everybody can benefit from, where we're not redistributing wealth? Will that question ever be answered? I don't know, but what can we do about this, right? What do we come into the new year? How do we deal with these situations? We'll have that when we get back here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. And you're back here on this final segment of the Andrew Cooperrider Show. So I've kind of just talked today, I guess you'd call it rambled a little bit, just about general economic development questions as we see time and time again our money wasted and we see issues continue because we are going into a new year. And most importantly, we're going into 2026. That's an election year. Half of our state senators are up for election. Every single one of our House members are up for election. Of course, Mitch McConnell's stepping down. His seat is open. We're going to have, obviously, a fight for that. Your county judge executives, your magistrates up for election. A lot of choices to be made here. And people talk all the time when I mention these things. They're like, nothing will be done about it. What are we going to do about it? So on and so forth. Here's the dirty little secret. If you want somebody to blame for why these things continue, you need but look in a mirror. Because we continue to vote for these people. Worse yet, we allow ourselves to be manipulated by those who attempt to control these people. I'll give you a great example. The budget comes out here in Kentucky. It's a 200-plus page document, has tons of earmarks in it for things that generally we'd agree with. This last budget had things like body armor in it, earmarked, had some other things in it. But it also spent way too darn much money. It also leaves Bashir way too much freedom to continue to mismanage funds and do the kinds of things he's doing now. So in turn, there were several people who voted no against it, Republicans voting no. They're saying, look, we're tired of spending the money. Now, they did prevail, but one of the things that they were attacked, of course, those who don't want to see them in there anymore, dumped a whole lot of money against them. And then, after they dumped a whole lot of money against them, ran ads like attacking them for not voting for body armor for police and how much they hate law enforcement. Now, it wasn't true that they hate law enforcement. They did technically not vote for body armor for police officers because it was bundled in with a whole lot of crud. And that's the first thing we have to do as individuals, as voters, as people. When we're addressing these kinds of things, you take issue with these problems. First off, talk to your legislator. Let them know you see this as an issue. And when you talk to them, don't demand from them and don't yell at them saying, why'd you vote for this or anything else? But ask them questions. Hey, what were the numbers on that? There's a few people who voted no on this last budget just because I asked them a simple question. So the budget came out in 2024 for the next 2 years. Kentucky does a budget every 2 years. So budget came out in 2024, and we're spending like 15% more, I think 16% more than we were the prior 2 years. Even accounting for inflation, it was a substantial increase. That was accounting for inflation, I believe. It was like 10, 15% more. I'd have to go back to see what the actual number was. And so, I'm talking to some legislators about it. And I said, hey, I just have a question about the budget. This was legislators in the budget committee. I said, I have a question about the budget. We're going up 10%. You guys aren't raising taxes, you're lowering it. The feds aren't giving us more money. Where did all this money that we're spending come from? Is there a specific line item that has increased dramatically year over year? Is there something specific where we can say, like, look, this is why we have this money? Before you okay the spending of money, maybe we should look at, where's the money coming from? Simple question. And so I asked that question. I asked it to probably 15 legislators. One of them in the budget committee put me in touch with LRC, which is like the support staff for the legislators, to attempt to answer my question. Long story short, it was never answered. Nobody could ever tell me what specifically has happened to cause us to have this much more money. What line item of revenue has increased? Because you can't spend, see, here's the thing. We have a balanced budget in Kentucky. You cannot spend more money unless one of two things happens, because you can't print money either. Either one, the federal government has upped the amount of money they're giving us, which that didn't happen in 2024, or two, somehow, some way, Kentuckians are paying more in taxes. That's the only ways the government in Kentucky can spend more money, period. That's where I was trying to find out. Where are we being taxed more now than we were 2 years ago? And nobody could tell me. And there's a few people that I said, look, before you vote for this budget, maybe let's find that question out. There's a few legislators that voted no on the budget because they could never answer that question themselves. And it led to, what's going on here? What's the deal? And so I bring that up to say that if you want to make a difference, one, get a relationship with your legislator, whoever that may be. Don't call them up yelling at them, but ask them questions, specific questions about a vote they're taking or an issue that's coming up, saying, what is this? What does this mean? What can we expect? Why do you support this? That's what I would do first. Second, I would stop allowing your vote to be bought. If you're looking at an election, and let's say it's a state house race, which has all of like 2,000 voters in it, and if somebody in that race has some PACs dumping hundreds of thousands of dollars for him, and they're spending $500,000 to convince 2,000 people to vote for this guy, chances are that's not the person you should be voting for. I'm just being honest with you. Because those quote unquote donors aren't dumping $500,000 out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it because they expect a payoff. It's an investment. It's not a donation to them. They expect to make money off you. And a lot of people are dumb enough to allow those $400,000 or $500,000 in a simple state house race, even with 2,000 voters, to convince them to vote for somebody that hates them, that wants to take money from their pocket, that's against their own wishes, that will do the opposite of what they want them to do. Sure, they may say a good game when they're go ahead and campaigning. All of them do. But you need to ask a question, unless that person is self-funding. Where did all this money come from? And should I be dumb enough to vote for somebody who the horse tracks or this corporations or those groups or the teachers unions, they're getting involved in Republican primaries in Kentucky, to vote for the person that they want in office? You shouldn't fall for it. And that's what concerns me, is the same people that see these posts I make, and I call out this spending, I call out these giveaways, I call out these issues, and they see it, and then they continue to vote in the same way they always have. They continue to vote for the same awful people that are voting yes on these issues. And you don't have to keep doing that. You can research who you're talking to. You can actually look at who do I want to support or not. That's I guess my greater call for this new year. We're coming into election season in 2026. If I say make a resolution, it's this. Politically, your resolution should be to pay attention to state politics, pay attention to what your legislators are doing, pay attention to what your county officials are doing, and vote accordingly. Do not fall for it. Don't allow your vote to be bought with a flashy mailer and an ad on your Facebook and a perfect curated speech. Do research. Dig into these people, please. I don't know how much longer our country can hold on if we continue to vote for the same people that are destroying it. I don't know. That's just, I guess that's just where I'm at, right? That's why I do this. You know, I know it's a new year, so you reflect on it. And somebody recently asked me, why do you do this? You make these posts, you do this. I know it takes a lot of your time. Why do you do it? That's why I do it. It's because I want the people to be informed, and I want them asking questions of how does this happen and how do we stop it? Because the power does rely with the people. Well, yeah, that's what we got time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Kicking off the year, hopefully, I don't know, enjoyed the show today. But we'll be back next week. I hope you have a great rest of your day.